All right, good morning and welcome to the Fairfield League of Women Voters 2023 Legislative Wrap-Up. Thank you all for coming, and thanks to Fair TV for broadcasting today. And thanks to our legislators, because they really had nothing else to do today. This has been a very busy time. The session just ended about 22 minutes ago, or at least it must feel that way. So really, I do thank our legislators. We have Senator Tony Hwang, Representative Sarah Kitt, Jennifer Leeper, and Kristen McCarthy-Vahey. So thank you once again for always showing up and being a part of our program. It's interesting, you know, I've heard people say that, you know, I only vote in national elections, or, you know, it's only the national politics that's important. Nothing really happens at the local level, which always dumbfounds me, because I think every issue, every cause, every piece of policy starts at the local level. And this is where it impacts us most of all, obviously. So I want to reiterate how important this is, and thank again our legislators for taking the time to speak to us, to listen to us, and to represent us and our views in Hartford. So thank you. Today we're going to start with remarks by each of our legislators. They'll have 2 to 3 minutes to speak, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience, which is an important part of it. But first, before you guys start, I'll have a question to start. And I'll continue asking questions if you don't. So that's either a promise or a threat. You can take it either way. So anyway, we'll just get started. You don't need to hear me. I would like each of our legislators to spend 2 to 3 minutes giving a brief update on the just completed legislative session. But please highlight one initiative you supported, one you did not, and why. And we'll start at this end. Tony, we'll start with you.
I'm not sure I need this, but good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Even though it's the end of session, it took a time to reflect on what we've been able to accomplish, and we did accomplish a lot. This session is a budget year, which means that we are longer into June. Next year we'll end in early May. But I would say, to answer Bryce's question, our biggest accomplishment was truly getting a budget done on time, having a bonding package as well that everybody in a bipartisan basis supported. And I think it began in January. In January, we all agreed to guardrails, that we need to live within our means. And that was a basis for how we managed our budget process. The second part of it was all of the parties got involved. Democrats, Republicans, House, Senate, along with the governor, were at the table providing ideas, and we had a collaborative effort that resulted in a document that most everybody, there was one no vote in the Senate, supported. So it really showed that when people collaborate and take differing ideas, whether it's liked or not, and that's the challenge, right? When people have different ideas that are different from you, and you're so passionate about it, you get really annoyed. But in a collaborative effort of equal power, you get results. And I think that's where we were at in regards to the budget. You said to point to one thing that I didn't like that went through the process. We hear so much about housing, and that many bills passed through on the House Committee and the Planning and Development Committee. But what was interesting was the fact that there was one bill that came out of Planning and Development that I loved, we worked on, that was to give tax abatement relief for private property owners that wanted to give easement allowances for open space, trails, and walking trails. Great idea. It allowed tax credits for people that wanted to share this land. Senate Bill 998 passed out of the Senate unanimously, went down to the House. Now, this was simply a 3-page bill that allowed easement on property to create more open space retention, right? Voila. An amendment came on it that had 40 sections related to tenant law, to affordable housing, and fair share zoning. 40 sections tacked onto a bill that came out at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night or Monday night. Debate went on till 2. It was divisive. There were anger in regards how it was done. Boom, came out with barely a plurality. I think it was like 86 to 76. Comes to the Senate. We had a vote on it on Wednesday before the end of session. We went on a 7-hour debate. And you'll hear about it. It's called a filibuster, that we argued about it. But the reality was, we took bills that were well-intentioned and we amended it. And I think, in my mind, it's the absolute usurpation of power. The majority had the ability to change a really good bill and jam ideas, 40 different ideas, that did not pass out of committee or did not pass in either chamber. That is, unfortunately, the ugly part of politicking and the power at work. So there's my 3 cents worth. Thank you.
Thank you. Sarah?
Thank you. First, I want to thank everybody here. It really was an honor for me to serve my first term up in Hartford. It was a learning experience, and I'm glad to say I survived. There are a few pieces of legislation that I am thrilled that we passed, one being the Child Marriage Act, which Loretta J. is here. She's an advocate who helped shepherd that through both chambers. Many of you might not have known that kids 16 and 17 years old could legally get married here in the state of Connecticut. So that is no longer legal. The legal age for marriage in Connecticut is 18. And I think that was an important thing that we passed to help for the health and safety of our young girls, to give them the best, and boys, to give them the best possible start in their futures. And I also am very proud of the work that went into House Bill 5001, which was to extend services for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And it's going to help thousands of adults across the state who have little to no access for services they need to live productive and independent lives as best they can. And when I was going around knocking doors last summer, that's one thing I heard from a lot of families who were worried about their adult children once they left our education system, and where were they going to go, what services were they going to have. And I said all along, one of the reasons I got into this was to give a voice to the people who had no voice in our legislative process. And so I feel really good that we were able to accomplish as much as we did. There's still a lot more work to be done. We need more funding for our nonprofit providers who provide these services, but we're on the right path. I'm going to take a little different tact about what I didn't support, because that gets into sort of a lot of partisan politics and personalities. I will say there's legislation I'm sad that didn't get through. There's a lot of good environmental bills that didn't get to see the light of day. Some really important bills regarding nursing homes and seniors, and even in our education system. So I was disappointed that a lot of those didn't get through, and I'm committed to working on those again next session and seeing if we can do a little better job.
Thank you. Jen?
Thanks, Bryce, and thanks so much to the League for always bringing us together. Maybe sometimes when we might prefer a little sleep, but it's great to do it now before we all get busy again and everything is fresh in our mind. So thank you so much for bringing us together. I'm Jen Leeper. I represent the 132nd portion of Fairfield and Southport. And this was a really great legislative session. I know Senator Wong already mentioned the budget, but this is the most bipartisan budget in recent history. It's more bipartisan than the 2017 bipartisan budget we hear so much about. It included the largest personal income tax cuts in state history, cutting both the 3% and the 5% marginal rates. We also expanded our tax relief to seniors so that you are no longer paying income tax on retirement income for joint filers up to $100,000. Single filers up to $100,000, joint filers up to $150,000, incorporating IRAs into the phase out of income tax. We prepaid an additional over $2 billion down on our pension liabilities, which we hear about all the time. It's not glamorous, but it's so important. We also set aside another $3.3 billion into the state's rainy day fund, which again is all a part of those fiscal guardrails that we agreed to at the beginning of session to continue to invest in and ensure our state stays in this much sunnier fiscal place we've been in the past couple years. We also, so I got to serve this past session as the vice chair of the Education Committee, which was a real honor, and we made the largest investment in public education in decades. We put $150 million into the Education Cost Sharing Grant, which really is the largest mechanism through which the state funds our schools to municipalities. We also fully funded excess cost, which is the state reimbursement for students who are outplaced, students with disabilities, and that can be a really expensive and volatile line item for school districts and therefore for communities, so fully funding that formula is huge. We also passed early voting, one of the most progressive gun violence prevention bills in the nation. We did that on a bipartisan basis. We did some important work on the energy front, giving PURA, which is our regulatory agency, more authority over our utilities, which is great. On the education standpoint, I was really happy to help facilitate this past year an indoor air quality working group, and then we got $375 million over the biennium invested in helping our schools improve their air quality systems. It's huge. It's, again, not glamorous work when you're doing things behind the walls. It's really important for health and safety of our children and our school staff. And here in Fairfield, because we've actually been doing this work for about 5 years, dating back to when I was still on the Board of Ed, we were very well positioned to apply for these grants because we've done all the engineering work that was required, and we were awarded $6.2 million to invest in our schools' indoor air quality, which, again, is just phenomenal because I think we all know the cost of these sorts of projects are astronomical. I could go on, but I won't. We've been working really hard, let's do one last thing, working really hard to have some smarter and more responsive policies around the Department of Transportation's tree clearing, particularly around our highways. And Senator Wong and I both really championed that this session, and there were several different vehicles, and this is part of what happens in the legislative process, because at the beginning, any of us can submit any bill. So you get a lot of duplication. But in the end, it was worked into the big, I think, DMV bill. And so now the Department of Transportation will have to work with an arborist around tree clearing, around a plan for replanting, what the native species are, because when we don't replant, actually we just create more space for the invasive species. That is part of what motivates the tree clearing in the first place. So it's not everything we wanted, but it's a really nice step in the right direction. And I'm sure that was more than 3 minutes, so I'll hand it over to my good colleague. But thanks again for everyone who came out today.
Thanks, Jen. Kristen, please.
Thank you, Bryce, and to the League, and everyone who's here with us today and watching this later. As many of you know, the League was the first group that I joined when I moved to Fairfield, and I'm proud to be here with you. So I'm Kristen McCarthy-Vahey. I represent Fairfield and Bridgeport. Bridgeport is now 25% of the 133rd District, something I like to share because I don't think a lot of people realize that in the redistricting that did occur. And I'm grateful to my colleagues for mentioning some of the issues that they have, which means that I am going to focus on the issues that came before the committees on which I serve, the 4 committees. And I co-chair public health. I'll save that for last, but I'm going to start with transportation. Many of you have heard me talk for years about infrastructure as it relates to our vulnerable user safety, as well as our cars, our public transit. In transportation, we passed an incredibly broad and really groundbreaking bill that will help us to stay healthy, safe, and strong, as I often talk about, Vision Zero. And this bill actually will now allow speed cameras and red light cameras in places where municipalities approve and designate certain areas. There are a lot of safeguards, including data privacy protection around this, but this is a proven strategy to save lives, and I'm glad we were able to get it over the finish line. It also includes watching a safety video when your license is renewed every other time. It does require a public hearing for that speed camera process. It requires the promotion of the use of seatbelts in some of our vulnerable communities, a public awareness campaign about impaired driving, which is one of the leading cause of our wrong-way deaths. And that's another piece of legislation that we were able to pass in transportation. At 120 highway exit ramps, we are going to have flashing lights at those high-risk areas. And we're also going to be having UConn study directional rumble strips as another way to prevent that. And then a pilot program for broadcast alerts. More people are dying on our highways than have. From 2020 to 2022, there were 832 fatalities, 832, and 3661 serious injuries. It's a tremendous issue, and we are some of the worst in the country. So these laws are really important. We're also going to now be doing training for our traffic authorities. We're increasing the fines for commercial vehicles on the Merritt Parkway. A little pet peeve of both Rep. Staffstrom and I, who is my carpool buddy. And then a cannabis component for our young drivers learning to drive, to understand that driving while impaired in any way is not safe. I spend a lot of time talking about that because the roadways impact all of us. We're all pedestrians at some point, whether you drive and get out at a parking lot or not. Rep. Leeper mentioned some of the GAE work. Early voting was an enormous measure that we passed this year, which will allow 14 days of early voting in general elections, 7 days in primaries, and 4 days in presidential and special elections. The other really important thing that we did was to pass again for the second time in this legislature the no excuse absentee ballot question, which will then go on the ballot next year for all of us to decide if we want to join most other states in allowing no excuse for voting absentee. Unfortunately, the lollipops didn't make it this year. Sorry, Dwight students. We also passed the State Voting Rights Act, and that was in actually sections 514 to 522 of our budget. So that does happen often. Things that were heard in other bills and in other committees get amended and put into other places, which is what happened with the housing bill. Almost every single section of that bill had been passed or approved through another vehicle. Finally, public health, I'll just say quickly and talk more about this. It was an incredible honor to chair the Public Health Committee this year. The committee has broad and sweeping cognizance over the Department of Public Health, the Department of Developmental Services, and the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. And we passed quite a few bills that will make an impact with respect to our opioid epidemic, with respect to our workforce. We had a bill that, again, was included in the budget and implementer about nursing staffing. We heard from our nurses in a 16-hour hearing what they've been through. We had a number of initiatives that will address workforce, the pipelines, whether it was our physical therapists, our psychologists, our physicians, or our licensed professional counselors and social workers, and our marriage and family therapists. So I was very grateful for the opportunity to work in such a bipartisan basis. My House and Senate colleagues, ranking members, as well as my co-chair in the Senate, we were able to do a lot of good work for maternal health and cost savings, the governor's sweeping bill that will provide some cost savings that should trickle down to our consumers, all of us. And finally, I would like to just say huge thanks to Jerry Spino and Fair TV. I wanted to do that while I had a moment. We know that Jerry is moving, and I know you're back there, Jerry. We have all benefited tremendously in this community from his work and his leadership on Fair TV. I see the thumbs up. Yes, thank you for joining me and recognizing him. Thank you, Bryce.
Thank you. I second that emotion, by the way. That's great. So I'm going to ask a question now, but I would offer any questions from the audience, if you have one, to come up to the podium at that time, okay? Don't be shy. All right, this question was submitted to us by someone that couldn't be here today. So I'll ask all of you to answer. Sarah, I'll start with you this time. Is there anything you can do to eliminate the tax on Social Security benefits in Connecticut? As a divorced senior of 75, how do I live in Fairfield on Social Security? And what other ways are you helping seniors?
That is an excellent question. As you heard Representative Leeper state that we have provided some tax relief for seniors on retirement income, and I'm committed to kind of moving that forward next session and increasing those tax breaks and finding other ways to make living here in Connecticut more affordable for our seniors who've given so much to our communities. And I'm also happy to say that I was able to secure, along with my colleagues, over $300,000 to go to our senior center to aid in capital improvements and programming. And a lot of their programming does center around financial issues for seniors and how to manage finances. But I am committed to working across the aisle and with the Senate on finding ways to make it easier for seniors to stay here.
Thanks. Jen?
I will second what Sarah said, which is that we did do this, and I'm really excited. It's a huge victory. It's an income source that probably, I think many people argue, should never have been taxed, and so I'm really grateful that we could deliver this relief to our seniors. And I also will give a shout out to the Fairfield Senior Advocates, who are some of the very best, most effective advocates I've come across, and we were really fortunate to have them up at the Capitol visiting us, talking directly with the House Chair of the Finance Committee, who is instrumental in ensuring these tax cuts make it through the process and are reflected in the budget, because it is a large loss of state revenue, and that needs to be accounted for. But committing to that and ensuring we're able to do it had broad bipartisan, both House and Senate commitment, and I thank them, the Fairfield Senior Advocates, for their leadership and very effective communication.
Thanks, Jen. Kristen?
I'd like to say ditto to what my colleagues have said, but I also am going to jump right into housing. It's one of the most expensive, we are one of the most expensive places to live, and often people will argue it's because of taxes, and this budget has delivered on tax relief at the state level. Property taxes are a tremendous burden, and so our seniors need a diverse housing stock and options for when they are not able to stay in a home that has, especially in the past few years, increased tremendously in value, and then those taxes have also increased, and that income is fixed, which becomes difficult. So oftentimes we find people looking for a different place to live in the community, but we don't have those options. In fact, Connecticut is topped by only 2 other states in the nation, Rhode Island and Alaska, in being the lowest per capita in housing development in the nation. And that has an impact, so basic supply and demand. I know it's a really difficult topic for us, but if we want to be able to keep our seniors, as well as attract young people, and keep our seniors' sanity so that they don't have to live with 4 generations or 3 generations, as when I knocked doors last year, no joke, in Fairfield, multiple families where there were 4 generations actually living in the same home in Fairfield. And that certainly was the case in Bridgeport, usually 3 generations more often, but it's a tremendous issue that we will need to continue to tackle in meaningful ways.
Thank you. Tony?
Thank you. And this was a bill that was bipartisan. It was an absolute focus of the Finance and Revenue Bonding Committee, which I serve on. And we had implemented and fast-tracked tax relief for seniors in regards to Social Security, retirement income. But it had a cliff. Had a cliff for single filers at $75,000 and joint at $100,000. So the reality is, if you made $75,001, you did not qualify. And we thought that was unfair in the context of Fairfield County, in which many of our seniors are asset-rich but cash-poor, but were penalized for that cliff. So that was the priority. So we've already implemented something, but we addressed the cliff. And what we did was, in this passage this year, increased it from $100,000 to single filers and $150,000 for joint filers. I had proposed a tiering effect as well for any individual with incremental increases in dollar amounts to not have a cliff. I think the second point of priority was I wanted to fast-track IRAs. IRAs are not exempt from the taxation revenue. So We initially was supposed to start this, I believe it got backtracked and delayed to 2025. But IRA investment revenue needs to be included for our seniors. A second part is we have to look at an overall package of affordability. Many of our seniors have fixed incomes, but unfortunately, the constant increase in our energy has been a factor. We're one of the highest cost in energy, and it's something that people cannot afford to do without. So we put in the bill, Senate Bill 7, the acronyms and the numbers befuddle everybody, but unfortunately, we've lived with it. But we did have some degree of control. One of the things that we did was we can lower your bills by decoupling a lot of the costs. So if you ever look at your utility bills, there are extra costs, conservation, stewardship, and et cetera. We had offered and decoupled it from your bill so that the legislative body can make a choice whether we wanted to undergo those programs or not and appropriate it properly. We should not have consumers subsidizing programs that we approve in the state of Connecticut. So decoupling and more oversight of the public utilities, regulatory authority over our utilities, but also greater accountability of your utilities. I think what we've seen in the past number of years is the arrogance of our utilities in not understanding that they have a fiduciary responsibility to serve as a public trust. But the arrogance has been palpable, and their storm response is deplorable. So I think energy cost is a factor. I want to follow up on housing. Housing is absolutely critical. As many of our seniors downsize and want to stay in our great community, there's not enough housing stock. Make no mistake about it, I completely agree that we have a critical housing shortage in the state of Connecticut. But here's where the wrinkle of the rules are. Under A30G, which everybody knows about, the formula to reach A30G requirements only counts senior housing at half a point. In my efforts 6 years ago, when we made some changes to A30G legislation that overrode Governor Malloy's veto, we gave a full point of credit for de-restricted senior housing. Unfortunately, this past year, that sunsetted after 5 years. So when we look at housing, it's absolutely critical. But why should we treat seniors and their need for housing any different under the state formula? They should get a full point and undertake the opportunity for our seniors and communities to build senior housing. There is a potential, there's a significant slowdown since the days of Parish Court, Pine Tree, and Sullivan McKinney that were 55 in age in regards to housing. There's been a significant slowdown in that because of the A30G for the past 30 years, because it's only a half point in your calculation. That is not an incentive when you're trying to reach A30G numbers. So again, we can talk about housing, but the devil's in the details, and unfortunately, current law only gives a half point credit for senior housing. There go, the mathematics says, I'm going to build other form of housing. So again, housing is complicated, it's emotional, and understandably so, but nevertheless, I've always taken the adage, local government has to have input. And unfortunately, what we're tracking to is state government knows best and one size fits all. And to me, that is not palatable. That is not acceptable. And it has devastating impact in communities, and people feel very powerless about that.
Thank you. Do we have a question from the audience? No. Can you go up to the podium, please? Thanks. This would be the first ever time that we didn't have a question.
But it isn't.
Exactly.
Okay. The question I have, this year looks like it's really been a good year. I was wondering, number one, why it was such a good year in terms of revenue over past years. And a lot of what we're doing, because we've had very, very lean years, where we had to go into the rainy day fund, defund some of the stuff. Has anyone done long-term planning before we do a lot of this? Let's say out 5 years, 10 years? So a lot of this up and down is smoothed out. So if we go lean, that a lot of this stuff isn't cut and we're faced with having to increase taxes, reduce spending in areas which were really being good now, but we may have to, it may come back to bite us.
Thank you so much for that question. I think it's really important. And I think it's something that the legislature pretty broadly shares a concern over and a commitment to ensuring that we're not passing programs that in another 2 years we're going to have to cut. I think there are still some areas of concern when we did the gas tax cut or holiday rather, that was revenue that wasn't going into the special transportation fund. I think there are concerns about the special transportation fund. But we have the fiscal guardrails that were instituted in 2017 that we made a commitment to in January to continue. So we have a spending cap. We have a requirement on a volatility cap, so revenues that are invested that come in above the cap go into the rainy day fund. Everything that goes above the cap of the rainy day fund prepays the pensions. And really bringing down those pension payments is a huge part of Connecticut's financial and fiscal future being less volatile. So roughly a quarter of all state funding is debt services. And a big part of that is because of our 70 years in the making unfunded pension liabilities. So we have made really meaningful progress over the past few years. We didn't expect to benefit from a global pandemic financially in the way we did, but it is an opportunity to make lemonade from lemons and help turn our state's economy around a bit. I think a huge infusion of federal funds, of course, always helps, and ensuring that we invested those as wisely as was possible so that we're not now needing to fill all those gaps with state funding. So there are a lot of also unhappy people this year. Our nonprofits are really struggling big time, and they estimated they needed about an 8% increase from us this year, and what they got was 2.5%. So, and that's for lots of different reasons. When the state several decades ago decided to close all of our state-run institutions, we said we were going to partner with nonprofits. We could deliver those services more affordably without them all being state employees, receiving pensions and health care benefits, and we would issue a block grant. We haven't really kept up our promise in terms of those block grants to these nonprofits, and every year, especially in those really volatile years, that was the line item that would get cut. Last year had the privilege to serve as the vice chair of the Human Services Committee. The Human Services Committee oversees all of our Medicaid spending. And a lot of these sort of nonprofit issues go through human services. And so I was hearing daily from many, many people just about how desperate the need is, both in terms of our staffing needs. These are incredibly challenging jobs that are very low paying. So a lot of the investment we make is actually in staff. There's also a need to expand capacity. And Representative Kitt mentioned we really prioritized our individuals with developmental and intellectual disabilities. Those folks become adults who maybe no longer have family to care for them, and we really need to be thinking and spend a lot of time thinking about how to expand capacity for those folks to have places to live that are safe and healthy and fulfilling, to help these folks have as fulfilling a life as possible. So we weren't able to do everything. I think probably all of us can see where the need was, but we were really committed to trying to prevent these big drops in funding and service year over year so we could have a smoother budget going forward over the long term. But I think there are still going to be areas of concern, no doubt, and I will let my other colleagues opine on this as well.
Thanks, Kristen.
Thank you. I feel like I'm the commercial announcement person today. So I'm wearing blue because our Fairfield-Ludlow softball team is playing in the Class LL championship today. And then I'm going to the car and changing into red because the boys are defending their state championship title, the Ward baseball team. So I'm only saying that because, yes, I know these student athletes are amazing, because I will have to leave right at the crack of my son and husband arriving to pick me up for that. But I want to share something that was shared on closing night, the governor came into the chamber for the first time in years at the end of the session. And both the speaker and the governor talked about the Connecticut way, which is the fact that we really do operate on a bipartisan basis. We're like a family, a dysfunctional family, which means we fight, we argue, but we all have strong relationships with people on the other side of the aisle. And the way our system works, it really requires compromise. It forces compromise. And in the last days of the legislature, some of the folks play legislative bingo. And one of the things that I said should have been on the bingo card, it's sometimes we say the same things, is fiscal guardrails. Senator Wong started today talking about those fiscal guardrails. Those fiscal guardrails really have saved us, and I think will do so in the days ahead. For years at this table, you heard me talking about pensions over and over and over. I went to Pension Academy in Kentucky. I brought a Pension Academy to Connecticut. Thank goodness. We are finally now paying attention to something that when you plant a seed, whether it's an investment or a debt, it grows, it compounds. And we are finally now addressing that. And I am so proud of the bipartisan work that's happened and that Rep. Leeper talked about. She also mentioned the Special Transportation Fund. And I want to take a moment to talk about that because in terms of volatility and in terms of impact, we know that our train ridership is back up. It's not back up to 100%. Our work habits are different. That Special Transportation Fund is a separate fund than the general fund, and it impacts how we fund public transit. It impacts how we fund our railroad. And we are going to be impacted by the reduction in ridership. Those are it's fare box recovery. We had free bus service for a while, which was tremendous, but had an impact. Greater Bridgeport Transit, for example, has a 30% fare box recovery. That's highest in the state. What does that mean for us? Without changing our revenue sources, and Rep. Leeper mentioned those federal funds coming in, we're not going to have, God forbid, let's not have another pandemic where we have this kind of financial disaster that requires the kind of input of the federal government, that influx of funds. So we're going to be needing to look at that. And I say that, very transparently. It's not popular at all. I have proposed multiple times bills that would allow our state to study vehicle miles traveled, which is something that Republican states on the West Coast are studying and are looking at pilot programs, because as we have the electrification of our fleet, a gas tax is not a sustainable source of revenue. We don't have tolls in our state, and this governor has made pretty clear we are not going to be looking at that. So we need to be able to at least look at what is the future of our Special Transportation Fund. And a few years back, in a very politically unpopular move, I voted against a bill that did pass, with bipartisan support, by the way, that said our state DOT couldn't even study vehicle miles traveled. It's time for us to take a look at that, because that's part of that long-term viability and that long-term, smoothing, I think, is a way you talked about that.
Thank you. Tony?
It's interesting, having been in the legislature for 14 years, I've seen the bust, and now I guess we're in the boom. And I'm a big student of history and realized that when we implemented the income tax in the state of Connecticut, it was a boom time, and we had money aplenty. The guardrails that were put in, that was 6 years ago, and it resulted when it was an 18-18 tie in the Senate. And it was a budget debate that lasted almost into October. But we came out with a budget where there was compromise and equal sharing of power that facilitated the decisions that we made. 6 years later, we are bearing the fruits of that, and we renewed that commitment. But we got to the boom because of federal tax law changes. We used nearly $2.5 billion of ARPA money to our budget the previous year. And many of our municipalities and Board of Eds benefited from the ARPA. So we have been able to have a great opportunity to be able to plan and manage our future in better times. We got bipartisan budget votes because we had the money to be able to allocate and make people somewhat happy. There was an ask of $350 million for our education in addition to the ECS. We gave $150. We gave 2.5% to our nonprofits. They were looking for 9%. So the reality was, all of that is deserving. But the challenge is, how do we live within our means and to be able to facilitate how we can address critical programs? But I think the important part of it is, we missed a great opportunity in this budget session with the opportunities we had to change government. I'll give you one great example. In our nonprofits, they are the very fabric of our community. They do such incredible work. But few people know that we're one of 3 states in the United States that have a dual delivery system. And what that means is, our state agencies do the same work as our nonprofits, but at a disproportionate pay, benefit, and cost. There was a survey that was done nearly 6-7 years ago at my bequest that looked at our nonprofits and how they did the same work and how it performed. It showed that it did equal, if not better, work to our state agencies at nearly 55 cents on the dollar. We've not talked about that anymore. The fact that we have shortchanged our nonprofits for the past 10 years is undeniable. They do incredible work, but nevertheless, they keep losing out to the same state employees that do the same work. Why are we not looking to change government for greater sustainability? Lost opportunity. I think the other part in regards to transportation, absolutely essential in our community here. I'm disappointed that we shortchanged the Metro North, and I implored to have more money put into the budget. But I'm happy to say, as the ranking member in bonding, we made a commitment to infrastructure funding. And I'll share that with you in the sense that it's probably intricacies people don't know, but we need to know that ending June 2023, this budget year that is ending, we allocated $860 million plus to special transportation obligation bonding, specific for transportation. I'm happy to report that in the next 2 years of the biennial budget, in 2024, we have allocated $1.5 billion plus in special transportation funding. And correspondingly, in 2025-26, it goes up to $1.86 billion plus. So we have made a commitment to build up an infrastructure. Now, that complemented with the infrastructure federal funding of nearly $5 billion that's being managed by our Revenue Commissioner, Mark Boughton, is a fantastic opportunity for us to address infrastructure and transportation improvements. Metro North and the appropriations, critical, but what we're looking at is a possible opportunity to make a transformational change to our transportation infrastructure. It doesn't get a lot of press, doesn't get a lot of billing, but I implore our communities to get project ready. And one of the integral parts was the bill that I co-introduced, and Representative Leeper was very instrumental as well in advocating for our community to implement a study in regards to tree cutting, but also sound barriers and decibel tests in regards to quality of life for many of our residents. We can supplement that into stage 2 of the transportation infrastructure initiative. So those are things that I'm thinking about in tying the pieces of what we do on a state, federal, to the benefit of our greater community. So I'm excited about it, but I also lament the fact that we missed opportunities to make long-term structural and sustainable changes that are of benefit to taxpayers and residents in Connecticut.
Thank you. Sarah?
Thank you. I'm not sure what more I can add. That's the hard part of being number 4. I do want to comment a little bit on our nonprofits. I come from a nonprofit background, more on the policy level, but have worked with organizations and individuals who provide these incredibly vital services to some of our most vulnerable residents. And for years, they were gutted financially during our lean times. And so it was very frustrating this year to go back to these people who are saying, we have this huge surplus, why can't you give us more money? And saying, we have to operate within these spending caps. But that is what's going to protect us in our lean years. So I feel confident that while we weren't able to provide what we wanted to these service providers, they're not facing huge cuts. Now, some will argue that the funding they did get was essentially a cut because it's been so long since they've had any increase. But at least we've stabilized them, and that's not enough, and I'm committed to doing more for them over the next years. But one thing we also need to talk about, it all comes back to housing. To protect ourselves in these lean years, we need to build our economy. We need to bring in more businesses. We need to bring in that tax base. And we can't do that unless we have housing for the employees that are going to come with those companies. So it's almost like everything we talk about comes back to housing. And we need to find a way to work across interest groups to find a way to build this workforce housing for people who might be in entry-level jobs, people just getting out of college and starting their careers, and our seniors. People do want to come to Connecticut. There's that fallacy that people are fleeing Connecticut. That's just not true. But we have to have places for these people to live. And I did vote against the housing bill because it did come through late. It was big. I wasn't comfortable because I did not know exactly what was in it. And I had a lot of constituents emailing me saying, absolutely no, we don't want this. But there's nothing in our statutes that says Fairfield and Fairfield County can't be doing whatever they can to build up our affordable housing stock, our workforce housing stock, our senior housing stock. There's nothing preventing us from doing that. So I am committed to working with advocates across the county and within Fairfield to develop plans that we can put into action now to help solve our housing crisis. And once we can make meaningful steps to tackling that issue, we can have an easier path to bringing in more corporations and businesses into the area to help build our tax base.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Please go up to the podium. And remember to hold the button. It's actually a bar at the bottom.
And I apologize. My youngest is at a sporting competition. I'm getting updates on where they are. It's divisionals for USA Climbing, and so I'm getting updates to how they're doing.
My name is Craig Diamond, I live in Fairfield, obviously. So I wanted to, first of all, thank all of you for your hard work over the last 5.5 months, and for all the valuable public service you provide to us, so thank you. So I have a very specific question about legislation and then a very general question. So and I'll ask, sorry, I'm asking 2 questions. So the first question is, one of the things that has always bothered me as a citizen, and this is transportation related, is and we've all been there, when I've been on the highway and somebody passes you going 120 miles per hour and weaving in and out like they think it's a video game. And it always just makes me very angry because it just seems like they're endangering not only themselves but everybody else around them. So I'm just wondering if there was anything in the recent legislation that addresses that kind of driving behavior, and if not, and how that can be addressed, maybe with new technology or other ways of policing, et cetera. And my other question is, Representative McCarthy-Vahey, you mentioned you thought that it's a very, I think it was you, that it was, you work in, Connecticut works in a bipartisan basis in the legislature, and I'm wondering if you all agree with that, and whether you do or not, how do you think that it can be even better in terms of the legislature working in a bipartisan basis?
Kristen, we start with you now.
I'm so excited that I get to start. I love this. I thank you so much for both of those questions, both of which are passion areas of mine. Last night, for fun on a Friday night, I watched the last Vision Zero meeting, which you can all watch online. It's on the Connecticut DOT website. Vision Zero means 0 deaths because of traffic-related fatalities. That's what we're going for. What we know is that highway speeds have gone up, and that's happened since COVID. And there are a lot of reasons for that. I am not a shy driver. I just drove a U-Haul through the streets of Brooklyn, parked the thing, and I had no problem all through multiple boroughs in New York. When I drive up 91 to go to Hartford every day, and I'm on the phone hands-free, with colleagues, almost every time I'm saying, oh my gosh, I'm watching this person coming up behind me. It's terrifying. Part of what the Vision Zero bill does is to address those things. I mentioned the safety videos, that when you renew your license, not every time, but every other time, which may not be enough, but that's a compromise. Those are the kinds of things we do. We currently have a pilot program, work zone speed cameras. This is a 2-year pilot program. The red light cameras and the school cameras, those are other options. The work zone cameras are probably the only thing that really specifically gets at it, but I'm going to say that when we look at things like this, there are now 6 E's. We used to talk about the 4 E's. Equity and evaluation are the 2 of the new ones, but education, encouragement, enforcement, and engineering are the things that impact how we interact on the roadway. And I'm going to use an example of our own, our circle, the Post Road Circle. We have been working in Fairfield for years to get that Post Road Circle redone so that it's usable for bicyclists, pedestrians, and a lot safer for cars. I'm proud to say that we encouraged our first selectwoman and spoke with our congressman to apply for a federal earmark. And to Senator Wong's point, that funding that he talked about, we will be seeking funds for Fairfield because that work has been done to study and prepare and get us ready to shovel ready for projects. So there's the highway piece of it, which is people always go to enforcement, but there's also design. And there's also the local roadways. Actually, so many of these accidents and pedestrian fatalities are on our local roadways. So I think that's one on that. I mean, I could talk a lot more about that, but I will also say that we all, as individuals, have our own responsibility to drive more safely and to obey the rules of the road, even if we're getting our child to school or trying to get to work on time or wherever we're going. So the last thing, the second question about being bipartisan, the final days of the legislative session are very intense, and the emotion levels go up to here because literally on the last day, you may have read that hundreds of bills remain on the calendar in the Senate and the House for action, and everyone is trying to get their legislation passed. So the stakes are high. And we all are in this because we feel passionately about what we want to do. What I always say, and even on the last day, had a conversation with a Senate colleague, and there was a lot of frustration. And I always encourage people to sit down and talk with one another face to face. And the youth minister in me always comes out, which is we're all humans first. We may strongly disagree on a policy. We may just be so frustrated with our colleagues. But we're all neighbors. Here, right here, all of us in this room, we're all neighbors. So going back to remembering that, and then going right back into that vigorous debate, because I can vigorously and passionately debate an issue and feel so strongly about it and so intense about it, but I can walk away and still be able to respect you as a human who has different opinions than I do. But that comes because we make those conscious connections and we're willing to talk with one another. And you see that in the committees that work best, and whether it's across party lines or within party lines, because it happens both ways, are the people who actually talk with one another. Not in those high-level moments, but throughout the course of time and have built that relationship over time. Thanks for letting me go on, Bryce.
Thank you. Tony?
Thank you, Craig. As the Republican leader on the Transportation Committee, we did make a collaborative, bipartisan effort to show a strong effort. It was a bipartisan co-introduction of Vision Zero. We worked closely with Commissioner Ucalito of Transportation. It was comprehensive, and certain parts of that bill were taken out. in order to facilitate passage of Vision Zero as an idea. Vision Zero started in the 1990s in Europe to address fatalities and serious injury of roads, not only for motor vehicle and their passengers, but for pedestrians, for bike riders, and all facets of roadway safety. And so it was important to have that as a branding to move forward, because this is an initiative that I believe in. It got stuck on traffic lights, speed cameras, and we made every effort in regards to concerns of profiling, concerns of privacy, concerns of Big Brother watching. We were able to get to a place where we made the move to facilitate and to accommodate. So long story short, Vision Zero is a great facilitator for transportation safety. And we did pass out a bill, and again, co-introduced, along with my Democratic chairs, the wrong-way driving. You know, when you talk about the numbers that are startling, we had nearly a 500% increase in wrong-way driving fatalities in the past number of years. That's just an astronomical number. And when you see that nearly 75 to 80% are impaired driving, you put the pieces together, and we facilitated, and I was one of the few individuals that looked at blood alcohol content. Look, there are many things that we looked at safety on the roads. Another part that doesn't get said a lot about is our state troopers have to enforce on Troop G from Stanford all the way up to New Haven, all the way up to Danbury. We need to replenish and hire more of our state troopers and law enforcement. There's just an impossible task in regards to enforcement. And I think the other part of the bill that we were very, very cognizant and passed on is the philosophy of lawlessness on our roads. So one of the things we addressed was street takeovers, the blatant and arrogant display of taking over streets and just creating terror in our communities. We created a task force that allows special enforcement powers. So again, little things that we can do that kind of blends and complements without being too onerous in regards to people's personal liberties. That being said, all the laws we make does not displace common sense, respect for others on the road. I think you can't legislate that. The governor has said that many times, and I agree with him. You can't legislate common sense, perhaps through greater awareness, greater education, and that's part of the goal of Vision Zero, that we could facilitate that. The other part that you said about bipartisanship, we do. Like I said, over 90% of our bills are bipartisan. But when people don't feel as though their ideas are being heard, and when the passionate advocates have the power to be able to dictate, then you have dissension, then you have disagreement. Like I said, in any regard of a compromise, from our households to up to state and federal level, if you don't have a sharing of ideas, you know, some of the best bills we pass leave some people unhappy. The budget, we talked about it. Our nonprofits aren't completely happy. Our educational advocates aren't completely happy. Many individuals, many entities are not happy, but we still compromise toward the middle. But unfortunately, with the one-party power, you can dictate, and it creates a dissension and a disconnect. And that's where people get angry and frustrated, that they don't have a say. So I think what you've been involved in is a braver way, is that it takes a lot of courage to go against the tide. Look, I was the only Senate Republican to vote for the gun violence bill. To me, as a representative of Newtown and Sandy Hook, and also seeing the divisiveness of these issues, we're no longer neighbors. It's us versus them. And even some of the most ardent advocacy organizations have taken on a very partisan tone. The thing I'll leave you on this is, and I'm grateful for the League to host this event today, but look, the crowds have dissipated. I hope we have a watching audience, but here, the talk is all about national politics. The talk is all about Republicans versus Democrats. It is no longer neighbor versus neighbor. We're going to have a municipal election this upcoming year, and I'm fearful that it'll be a debate about personalities and national politics. not about local issues. And I hope we move toward discussing issues like neighbors and having disagreements and having an opportunity to have disagreements and dialogue where we can learn from each other, rather than say, if you don't agree with me, you're wrong and you're bad. We got to move away from that. And I appreciate the Braver Way. A little shout out to your organization for doing that or trying to get to that. So thank you. Thank you, Bryce.
Thanks. Sarah?
Thank you. I want to echo what my good colleagues have said about the Vision Zero initiative and making our streets safer. And the senator's right. When it comes down to personal behavior, we can legislate as much as we want, but there are still going to be people who are driving 100 miles an hour down the Merritt, and we see that on a nightly basis when we're coming back down from Hartford. But I do applaud the work of the Vision Zero Council and everyone who's working to make sure that our roads are safer. Having 2 new drivers on the road, it's especially important to me. And we need to do a lot more of education with our young people and, quite honestly, the adults who are driving our roads about just how dangerous their behavior is. I'm not going to spend too much time on it because I think my colleagues have already spoken quite a bit about Vision Zero and the great work that we've done this session to improve the safety of our roads. Talking about bipartisanship, I think people would be surprised at just how bipartisan things are up in Hartford. Even within our own Democratic caucus, I think a lot of you would be surprised at the discussions that we have going around the caucus room. And even as a group, it's not single party rule. There are many divisions within our own party. And so we do listen to each other. We hear all voices. And sometimes you don't get heard because, quite honestly, that's how our government works. It's a government of the majority. And that's how the people of the state have voted, and that's who they've sent to represent them. So it's frustrating. I've only been in Connecticut for about 7 years now, and I come from a state where I was a minority. Being a Democrat, I was a minority, and it was frustrating, and quite frankly, I got angry. So I understand the passion coming from the other side, the frustration coming from the other side. That's how we've decided our government's going to work. So sometimes you're in the majority and sometimes you're in the minority. But the important thing is that we come together to do what's best for the people we represent. And I've already been talking with people across the aisle about how are we, bills that we both felt passionate about that didn't get over the finish line, and how can we work together to get these across the finish line next time? How do we compromise? How do we strengthen the language? How do we soften the language? And that's how we get things done. And that's how anything gets done in this town, in the state, in the country, is when we can listen to each other and recognize that we're all trying to do the best for the people we represent. Sometimes it does come down to ideology, and that's when you hit a brick wall. And we do our best to go around and over those walls to achieve our goals. But sometimes we do have to admit defeat, and the wall is there. And maybe we live to fight another day, or we try to take that wall down brick by brick. So that's just to say, we do work collaboratively across the aisle, and not everything the liberals want gets through, and not everything the conservatives want to get done gets done. But we are all doing our very best up there.
Thank you. Jen?
I'll try to be quick. In terms of transportation, just the same way we're seeing staff shortages in our schools, and our hospitals, and our restaurants, in our nursing homes, our law enforcement is also experiencing staff shortages. And so we have tried to, in what the purview of the legislature is our state troopers, have additional classes, graduating additional classes of state troopers. We've increased the funding for state troopers to try to get some more enforcement on the roads. My good colleagues here spoke a lot about the preventative measures, the education, increased awareness, but I just wanted to touch on that piece about enforcement. And in terms of bipartisanship, We have a longstanding tradition in the Connecticut State Legislature to never, quote, call the question, which means we allow for unlimited debate. When you have unlimited debate, it means a single member in either chamber can really kill anything. So it really motivates compromise because we all know that that is a possibility with any piece of legislation. And I will say, particularly within, I think, each chamber, just because we work closely with our House colleagues, and I would presume that the Senate works more closely with the Senate colleagues just because that's where we spend the bulk of our time, there are very strong bipartisan relationships within each chamber. And not, unanimously, of course, but I think there's a lot of incentive and desire amongst all of us to have those relationships. We'll benefit from those relationships and opportunities to learn from one another and find and build on common ground. And I don't want to be too Pollyanna. As Representative McCarthy-Vahey said, those last several days of the session can be very intense. And there's an expression that on those final 3 days, it comes down to the 3 Ps: politics, personality, and then policy. Because it gets emotional. You've worked many, many months, many, many hours with lots of different stakeholders on an issue and can really hit a brick wall, as Sarah mentioned, if someone isn't willing to compromise or listen or work together. But generally speaking, as everyone has said, about 90% of what we do is bipartisan. And both the governor and speaker, I think, referenced our pride in that fact, both on opening day and on closing day. And I think it's a really great reminder to end session with that reminder of that commitment. And I think source of pride for our state because it sets us apart from so much of what we see across the country. And I think it's really important to ensure that our constituents know that we are not Washington and we really do value working together and ensuring that as much as possible, the work we do is rooted in good policy that benefits the lives of Connecticut residents.
Thank you. Thank you all. You were just able to pass a $51 billion budget, and you should all get applause for that. But within the budget process, nobody gets everything that they want. That's the process. It's the name of the game. Would you please relate one thing, if you were magic, that you would change in this budget, whether it would be to add it or subtract it, and why? And Tony, we start with you.
Democracy is not pretty, and you have many different voices in it. And I've talked about it from a perspective of one-party control that dictates what happens in the state. If there's one thing I could change about this budget would be the doggone implementer. And I bet you very few people understand what an implementer is. We have the budget with your P&L and your data and your numbers and the financials that make government work. The implementer is a document that implements it, gives you the direction and the guidance in regards to what to do with that dollar. And usually the implementer is a separate document. But in this year's case, the implementer was also the budget. And it came out at 3 a.m. on Tuesday before the end of session. And it was 832 pages, and I believe I forgot how many sections, there were so many, but nearly a third of it were laws or proposal legislation that never passed either the House or the Senate. It might have passed out committee, and some of which may not have even had a public hearing. And that was all put into the budget implementer by one vote. You're going to either vote it down or vote it up. In this case, when it was truly bipartisan, everything gets tacked in. But in past years, when there was dissension and debate about the budget, you had nearly, use this case, maybe 55, 60 bills and issues that you voted on and turned down. It may be about education funding. It may be about nonprofits. It may be about LGBTQ plus issues. But it was in the budget. And by one vote, you are tagged with either supporting or not supporting it. That's not good government, okay? And so when people understand the budget should be a document that should be standalone instead of having implementer put in. We have a special phrase for that up in Hartford, the special deal and legislation that's put into big packages, particularly the budget implementer. We call them rats because it is such disdain. But here's the rule I said to some of my colleagues. If your bill's in the budget, you love it. But if you hated it, it's a rat. So again, if there was anything I could say about the sausage making of politics, it is the implementer. And people should fully understand that it is not just simply the budget. And a case in point is, I supported the John Lewis Voting Rights Act bill. It passed out of the Senate with my support. It was slightly bipartisan, but there was a real concern in regards to it passing in the House. Well, guess what? An entire comprehensive voting rights bill, which I know the League is fiercely proud of, got tacked into the budget. It never got voted on as a standalone bill in the House because there might not have been enough votes. Now, the bottom line I'll leave this is this. It's not just bad government policy and one power drives all, but it's a disrespect for the hundreds of thousands of people that came and testified, submitted emails on specific bills of their passion and of their advocacy, to now see it all lumped into one bill. I know it's expedient, I know it's, but if it's controversial, keep it out of it. Let's have the merits of its fight on its own. And I know the expediency of time and policy makes that happen. So if I could, the implementer is a document that people should know and be much more familiar about.
Kristen, can we hit you up?
Thank you so much. I literally just asked Sarah and Jen, do you guys mind if I go? My baseball player is en route from Stanford, and I'm headed to the park and ride to meet them. So thank you again for having us, and thanks to my colleagues. You know, every single one of us at this table is in leadership at the Capitol. We all serve as leaders on various committees or in caucus, and I think that's really great for Fairfield. Mine is whereas Senator Wong was talking about broad brushes, I'm going to talk about a very specific example. And it gives you an idea that we have to look at these issues systemically, but also when we're trying to get things done, we have to get down to the very, very nitty-gritty. And for me, one example of what didn't work and what I wish we could do a little differently, and I've already started to ask caucuses to do this a little differently, was funding related to social workers and their annual license fees. The Senate had a bill that did one set of things for social workers, our largest and most diverse mental health workforce, the people who are helping all of us. It's not just a children's mental health crisis, it's for adults as well. And in the House, we had a different bill that was in a different committee. And I was able to assure that we would have funds to allow our licensed clinical social workers to also have their annual registration fees removed. But because of the communication and some misunderstanding, we weren't able to do that this year. And it was really disappointing, and a lesson in how we have to better communicate and collaborate, coordinate, and get help from both chambers, all caucuses, to make sure that we're rowing in the same direction when we're all trying to do the same thing. So we were all trying to do something very similar. And it's just a very small example, but it goes back to that communication. And Jen used those 3 Ps. Those are 3 Ps that I talk about a lot. Policy, we get on the same page. Politics always has an impact at the Capitol. And then personality. So I do hope next year that we can do better for our social workers. It's a small example, but it just gives you a sense. All 4 of us are in those, I'm going to say small, but big conversations about issue after issue after issue, and those puzzle pieces come together to make the whole. Thank you again, and I apologize for sneaking out early.
Not a problem, and good luck. Have a great afternoon.
Go War Baseball.
Sarah, would you like to go?
Thank you. And before she leaves, I just want to say a huge thank you to Representative McCarthy-Vahey for being an amazing mentor and source of support to this freshman up in Hartford. I could not have made it through this year without you. Going back to the budget, one thing that did disappoint me, and I'm going to go back to it, is the nonprofit providers. Again, making sure that our most vulnerable residents have the care and support they need is a passion of mine, and I think we need to re-examine how we deliver these services and how we pay for the people who are providing them. And they deserve what they're asking for. Their jobs are hard, and oftentimes thankless. So that was my one big disappointment in the budget this year. The implementer, yes, it's messy. I would prefer that we saw things piece by piece and we approved everything. But as Representative Leeper pointed out, we don't call the question. So sometimes we do have to move things into the implementer that we believe are important and need to be funded. And otherwise, they would never see the light of day because of filibustering from both sides. I'm not going to cast aspersions on different parties. But we're a part-time legislature, and if we want a budget and we want it on time, sometimes we do have to use the implementer. The implementer was new to me. I was learning all about that this session. I would prefer a more transparent process, but again, we are blessed or cursed, however you want to look at it, with the type of legislature we have. I'll say there are also rats in the bills that we see at the last minute too, not just in the implementer. And it makes our job challenging. And I think most people do try to avoid them and do their best. And I would say 99.9% of legislators up there are doing things in good faith and putting out good bills. So again, my first time around with this budget, I'm still learning the whole process and the ins and outs. So I'm going to move over to Jen, who can give a little better insight.
Thanks, Bryce. Thanks, Sarah. Lots of things I wish I'd made it in that didn't make it over the finish line, but two really specific ones. I'm very, very concerned about our health providers who treat people on Medicaid. They haven't gotten rate increases, some of them, particularly providers of Husky C, for over 20 years. And so what's happening is they're leaving serving the population because they can't make ends meet to serve, or they have caps. We'll take 20 Medicaid patients, that's it in this practice. And as we're increasing our population who's covered by Medicaid, especially after the pandemic, I'm very concerned about what's going to happen to our healthcare system, in particular, our most vulnerable. So I had really hoped we were going to meaningfully increase those reimbursement rates, and especially for both specialists, but also our general practitioners. It's something to keep your eye on, and I hear from a lot of our physicians in this community who want to treat patients on Medicaid, and it's getting increasingly difficult. That aside, something else really specific that was a real passion of mine was to provide property tax relief for veterans who are 100% disabled due to service. It's actually a really small number of individuals across the state, roughly 3,500. And to think that these individuals become 100% disabled because of their service to us, our country, their belief in our democracy, and we can't find the funds to provide this property tax relief, for me, is honestly shameful. And I don't usually like to use that word, but we were able to allocate the funds this year for about a 50% local match. So communities could get 50% reimbursement. I felt like the Office of Fiscal Analysis, they give fiscal notes. How much is this policy going to cost the state? Was extremely high. I actually went back to them about some of their assumptions, and they dropped the cost $10 million. I think some of the fiscal note was still pretty high based on their assumptions, but they have to make assumptions to come up with some sort of number. But I am deeply committed to continuing that work next year. And we do have some of the funds set aside, so if we can get the policy piece, we can deliver some of this financial relief, because these veterans in particular should have the peace of mind to be able to stay and age in place where they have the support networks that they need, access to their medical providers, and all of those services that help them live meaningful, independent, fulfilled lives. So those are two for me. Thanks, Bryce.
All right, one final question.
Now I see it. Now I see it. Well, I have two follow-up questions that I hope our moderator will allow me to say it equals one regular question. Thank you, Madam Moderator. Margaret Mary Fitzgerald, 2720 Easton Turnpike. Implementer bill, quick question. Were additional monies put in the implementer bill to fully fund the early voting program? Because I had read in the Connecticut Mirror that our state secretary projected that the state was perhaps at least $3 million lacking in fully implementing the early voting program, which obviously is a priority of the league.
Sarah, I think we start with you.
You know, I'm going to actually defer to Jen. I don't have that number in front of me.
I don't think we did. I think we allocated $1.8 million for early voting, and I do believe our Secretary of State, who was a classmate of mine in the legislature and a good friend, is not happy with us. Absolutely, and I hope it's something she plans to come back to us next year in the budget adjustment to fight for, especially leading up to the presidential election.
Tony, do you have anything to add?
You know, I think, as Representative Leeper stated, that is the status quo, but I am aware that there is conversation going on with the governor's office and the Office of Policy and Management, as well as the Secretary of State. There were significant allocations for new tabulators and money implemented, but as kind of a public service announcement, the no excuse absentee voting will be on the ballot next year. And I know people who are savvy and says, haven't we done this before? It is a multi-pronged process. We did vote on it this past year to remove it from our Constitution. Now the enactment is to have a referendum to now remove and implement no excuse absentee voting. That should be separated from early voting passage, which was passed out and will be put into effect with regards to the 14 days to be able to vote. But here's some of the questions I had. You can vote 30 days before by absentee ballot. So we had a debate question about that. But nevertheless, the public service announcement is there is a ballot initiative I'm sure the league will be very involved in. But at the same time, I know there's a conversation right now going on with the Secretary of State relative to funding, because you can't execute a plan without the funding. And for me, in the floor debate in the Senate, I articulated the fact that if we're going to do it, we better do it right. And we better do it with the consummate precision and perfection, because any flaw, any mistake along the way would undermine the goal and allow the detractors to say it's a flawed system.
Thank you, both, all. My second follow-up question has to do with Senator Wong. You mentioned before in your remarks that currently affordable housing for seniors only is given 0.5, I don't know the exact, but the wording, but 0.5 rather than a full point in terms of how we calculate 830G. What is the thinking behind folks who disagree with counting for senior housing as at a full point? What's the rationale there, the other side of the coin? And thank you.
Having been the past chairman of housing and having served in many years in housing and planning development as well, let me be clear. We have a housing access and affordability crisis in the state of Connecticut. But it not only exists in suburbs, but it exists in our cities. It exists in our rural areas. And the 830G formula is now nearly 30-plus years old, which created a calculation that if communities that do not have a percentage of deed-restricted affordable housing, not market-rate affordable, but deed-restricted affordable housing, they are subject to 830G, which overrides local zoning and conservation ordinances and laws. With that said, the calculation to get to that number has, in the origination was, the focus was on unit housing, family housing, to be able to allow family, kids to be able to come into a community, to be able to enjoy the quality of life and the high level of education. So the focus of A30G was really emphasizing family unit housing. And they detracted by reducing the count on the formula for senior housing because they said many of our communities in the suburbs have built out senior housing because they don't tax our education system. They're easy transition from empty nesters who are familiar with the community, and there's a tremendous desire and a need for senior transition housing. So as a result, they said, far too many of your communities are building these senior housing and not truly being diverse and accessible for family units into housing. So that was a rationale. In the change in A30G, which we were able to facilitate, we said, look, housing for everyone needs to be in place. Why are we discriminating against seniors? And so unfortunately, that sunsetted, that formula is back in place, and you're going to see a much more concentration on multiple family units. It's a philosophy, but nevertheless, I think we should also emphasize in part to create affordable housing for our seniors as well.
Thank you very much. I think that kind of answered it all. I appreciate that.
No, thank you.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you so much to our legislators for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.